welcome. I'm Susan Heuser-Ladwig from the Perham Area Public Library in Perham, Minnesota. We are very excited to be working with the Viking Library System and the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library to host this evening's program. We at the Perham Library are always enthusiastic whenever we have the opportunity to work with any Minnesota Book Award winning authors, and we've enjoyed hosting a number of in-person events featuring those authors over the years. Well, we would have loved to have hosted this evening's program in person in Perham, and I would have loved to have welcomed all of you to our physical library building this evening. We are nonetheless delighted to have this online alternative to an in-person event. I'm very grateful to the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in making this safe online alternative a reality this evening. So once again, welcome to the program this evening. Sit back with a cozy blanket and a cup of tea or hot chocolate and try to ignore the fact that we, at least in our area, have already had our first snowstorm of the year in October. We have a great program coming up.
Hey, thank you so much, Susan. I'm now sad that I didn't make myself a cup of tea. I am Wendy Worden, the Programs and Services Assistant at the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is the Library of Congress designated Minnesota Center for the Book. And I'm so pleased to welcome you all this evening for this Moving Words Writers Across Minnesota event featuring the talents of Peter Geye, Kaethe Schwehn, Chaun, Webster, and Diane Wilson. As we get started tonight, we would like to acknowledge the Dakota people, Indigenous keepers of the land from which we broadcast, at least on the St. Paul side. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. I also want to acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow Indigenous inhabitants of this land. Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of stories in this place now called Minnesota, and we at the Friends honor that tradition and the values and knowledge embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. The Friends has coordinated the year-long Minnesota Book Awards program for 14 years, and as Minnesota's Center for the Book, we produce programming that benefits all ages and reaches all corners of the state. This programming is supported by funding for the Center for the Book included in Minnesota's K-12 education bill, and we are grateful to all the state representatives and senators who advocated for that funding. On to our main event. This series was made possible by the state of Minnesota through a grant to the Minnesota Department of Education, and additional support is provided by the Harlan Boss Foundation for the Arts and Education Minnesota. We will have readings and conversation followed by a Q&A with you, our audience. Biographies of each panelist will be posted in the chat by my dear friend Amelia, who will also be feeding questions to the panelists and myself for the evening. So feel free to plonk your questions in the chat at any time. We have partnered with Next Chapter Bookseller in St. Paul and Willow Bookstore in Perham for book sales this evening. So do remember to purchase works by our featured writers. We will put other links in the chat throughout the night, so keep an eye there. And now, to start things off, we will have a reading and presentation from each individual author. First, I'd like to welcome Peter Geye. His latest book is Northernmost, and that is just out recently. Peter, welcome.
Thanks, Wendy. Yes, I'm off mute.
Yes.
And so yeah, it's such a pleasure to be here tonight. It is so sad that we're not all together, but we're making do the best we can. I'd like to say thanks to just a couple of folks. First, of course, to the Friends of the St. Paul Public Libraries for being such terrific stewards. Really, we're so lucky to have you, and I'm so lucky to count so many of you as friends. To the Viking Library System and to the folks at Perham, especially Susan, thank you for that warm introduction. And of course to all of you in the audience for joining us tonight. There's always something else happening in the world, and it means a lot to me whenever anyone comes to hear us read. I'm very lucky tonight to be joined by Diane and Kaethe and Chaun. It's an honor to be a part of this with you tonight. So Wendy mentioned that my new book is called Northernmost. It just came out a couple of months ago now, I guess. It is a third book in a story about a single family. And this book straddles two storylines. One of them is older, taking place in the 1890s. And then there's a contemporary storyline. The 3 times great granddaughter of the 19th century character is herself sort of studying this man's life. And I'm going to read a brief section tonight that straddles those two storylines, that begins in 1897 in a town called Hammerfest, Norway, which is reported or purported to be the northernmost town in the world. And all you need to know is that this man, his name is Odd Einar, he's just returned from a very long time away. And this is what he finds. He's stopped at his flat in town in the village and found no one there. And because he doesn't know what else to do, he's walked out to the cemetery to see what procession was just on their way there. And this is what he found. This is 1897. "My God, can that be you?" she said. "Inger?" Did I say her name aloud? Did I say, "Is that you?" I noticed Bengt and the pastor step back together as though startled. Inger's eyes widened as the horses had, and she looked down at her Bible and closed it, and then looked at me from bottom to top. I took my hat from my head and held it before me as if I was some gentleman. I could see her trembling hands and heaving chest, and when stepping closer, her wet eyes now glaring at the gravestone at her feet. "Inger, is that our daughter? Is that my Thea?" I said. She looked up and blinked the wetness away. "Thea," she said, and shook her head no. She said "Thea" again and finally came to me. She put a hand on my shoulder and then on my face and said, her fingers still in my ratty beard, "But you're dead, Odd Einar." Dead? That's what they said on Spitsbergen, you and that man, Birger Nicholson, at Crossfjorden, killed by an ice bear. She kept her hand on my face as though she could not otherwise believe I was there. "Birger died on the Crossfjorden, but I didn't. I'm home, Inger." When she dropped her hand, I could see the softness of the inside of her wrist and the pink of her cold flesh. What trailed her hand was a fresh scent, nearly floral, something I'd never smelled before. Bengt coughed, and Inger looked over her shoulder, stuffed her hand into her pocket, and in the same motion stepped back beside the gravestone. The pastor came forward, and now he rested his hand on my shoulder and raised his gaze to the still shrouded skies. "The waters saw thee, O God, the waters saw thee. They were afraid. The depths were also troubled." At this he looked at me. "I was but a man," he said softly before walking over to the carriage and climbing onto the seat. Now I looked at Bengt, his thumbs hooked in his frock coat as he looked down his veiny nose. The grin of a fatted man spread across his face. He stepped to the gravestone and took Inger by the elbow, kicking at the ground with his leather boot. "Don't carve in stone what could be branded on birchboard. I guess that's the moral of this story." He bent his thick neck and whispered something in Inger's ear before turning back to me. "But don't you worry, Odd Einar. I'll add the cost of this stone to what's already owed." Then he too walked to the carriage, where he handed Inger her purse and took his seat next to the pastor. The horse nickered and turned down the cemetery path. Inger watched them go, the fog going with them, and I looked down at the gravestone. Odd Einar Eid, it read, born 1854. Tappaisi Herrensjahr 1897. She turned to me, my wife did, and the look on her face left me to wish I had been lost on the ice in this treacherous year of life. The next chapter begins in 2017. She might have been watching herself asleep at home, the soft rise and fall of her belly and the arch of her hip under the gray duvet made violet by winter's darkness. But she wasn't watching herself, and she certainly wasn't sleeping. She hadn't slept properly since she couldn't remember when, and so she wasn't dreaming herself into a hummock of snow. She knew the mounds and curves were buried gravestones, taking light from the quivering aurora. She followed the light skyward up above the hillside as it melded into the blues and greens, and then an almost glaring orange, the color of a Lake Superior sunrise. She could as easily have been standing back on the shoreline in Gunflint now, her evening behind her. But in fact, she had never been so far from home. And all that stood behind her was the dark church, and beyond that, Sorrow Sound, and the islands distant across the water. She resisted an inclination to turn around and stare seaward, moving instead to another grave marker and brushing off the snow. She'd arrived here in the graveyard with as little forethought as she'd used in flying north altogether. Upon landing in Hammerfest, she checked into a hotel and tried to sleep and then tried to eat. Failing at the last two tasks, she put her boots back on and stepped again into the darkness. On the Strandgata, she looked left and right and saw in the latter snowy distance the church steeple. It seemed as fine a destination as any, and 2 blocks later, she crossed into the cemetery with her mind suddenly on her ancestors who might be buried here. She cleared the first few markers of snow and played her iPhone's flashlight over the ground. She did this half a dozen times and then looked down the line of graves before scanning the graveyard altogether. Hundreds of stones were mounded under the snow. So instead of harvesting ghosts, she bunched her coat collar and gazed upward and studied the sky for what seemed a long time. If she missed her husband Franz or the kids, she didn't feel it. Even as she conjured them sitting around the fire ring outside her father's fish house on a night such as this, the sky over Minnesota lit with its own phosphorescence, she felt only her own heart beating in time with the falling light of the polar sky above. Was it really only a month ago they last gathered around that campfire? The kids roasted marshmallows. Franz had graham crackers and candy bars ready for s'mores. Because he was always vying for their attention, he moved opposite the kids and arranged his face so it was lit by the Halloween blaze. "You guys might not believe this," he said slowly, the last faint trace of his accent still on his voice some 20 years after she heard it for the first time. "But those auroras are not a natural phenomenon at all. No, sir. They're the wailing sounds of all the dead women who never married." He looked at Liv, the only one young or smitten enough to be enchanted by this old saw, and added, "It might seem a wondrous thing, Liv, my love, to live among the stars. But think of all that time and never touching the earth again." If Greta had been paying attention, she might have realized these words were meant not for Liv, but for her, might have noticed the look of sadness on her husband's face, but she didn't. She simply hadn't been paying attention. In this respect, she was as culpable as he. Franz was in Norway himself now, in Oslo, not Hammerfest. She traveled there, thinking she was ready to confront him, to put to rights all that was wrong between them, or finally end it trying. Yet when she deplaned in Oslo and saw the departures board in the terminal included a flight for Hammerfest, she changed courses instinctively. The assurance of all the miles cross-country and up the coast dividing them suddenly urgent. Was that the point of being here? To find a new distance, a more difficult terrain, a foreign one at that? Surely this was on offer, in cold and snow of an otherworldly sort. The chill was duller and slower than she'd known in her life, the snow livelier. As she considered this, a gust off the hillside came up beneath her, lifting snow from the ground that twinkled and took shape before her, as if the ghosts of her ancestors were indeed there to meet her. Thank you.
Well, it is almost Halloween, and one forgets sometimes in this era of time folding on itself in the weirdest ways. So I appreciate, Peter, that you gave us a little bit of spooky. I enjoyed that. For our next writer this evening, we will have Kaethe Schwehn, who teaches at the Loft and St. Olaf College, and she writes across many genres. Welcome, Kaethe.
Hello. I will reiterate, can you guys hear me? I hope so, or I hope someone will let me know if you can't.
Yes, we're good.
You got it? All right. So I will reiterate what Peter said, in that I am so thrilled to be here with all of you. And thanks to Susan and Gail and Wendy and Amelia. And I'm thrilled to hear from the other writers. And I finished Northernmost recently. I highly recommend it. Yes, pick it up and read it soon. I wanted to share with all of you a little snippet from the new book that I've been working on, that's in about revision number 456 right now, I think. Hopefully nearing the end. The book is called The Gospel of Salome, and it opens in the year 38 CE in Alexandria. And so I'm going to read you a really brief paragraph that sort of explains the predicament in 38 CE Alexandria, and then I'll read you another portion too. Alexandrians fill the street in 38 CE, the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians, each with their own quarter and language and customs, each with their own gods, though sometimes like recipes, these are traded among the people. But in the summer of 38 CE, the people of Israel, the Jews whose ancestors helped to build the city 300 years before, they are missing from the streets. 3 weeks ago, a decision wafted back across the waters from Rome. Emperor Gaius Caligula issued a mandata that said the rights of the Hebrew people are rescinded. They are designated as aliens and foreigners. And so in 38 CE in Alexandria, an entire people have been pressed together, their tiny territory marked by stones and guarded by members of the Greek gymnasias, mostly big, dumb men who have a thirst for power. The houses of the Hebrew people, stripped before their eyes, now stand empty. So into this moment, which is a true historical moment, mostly documented by Philo, who was a Jewish philosopher, steps a man in my fictitious novel named John Mark. And John Mark is a first follower of Yeshua, or Jesus. And he's come from Jerusalem to Alexandria to preach the good news. But John Mark has some doubts. He's not necessarily sure he buys into the whole resurrection thing. And he's been told that if he gets to Alexandria, he should look up a woman named Salome, who is a physician, and that Salome will have some answers for him. So he eventually finds Salome and asks her how she fits into this story about Yeshua and Yeshua's ministry. And Salome reveals that she actually is the mother of Jesus, of Yeshua. And so the book, sort of like Peter's was saying, moves back and forth in time then between 38 CE Alexandria and these riots that are about to be set forth on the Jewish people. And then it moves back in time to Salome's story also that she's telling. And I'm telling you all this in part because the book works up to a part where Salome and John Mark and 7 really sick patients, because Salome is a physician, are trapped in an upper room in the Jewish quarter, and they can hear the mob getting closer and closer. And they're pretty certain that they're all going to die. And Salome, who has relied on her physician skills this whole time, has run out of things to do to help people. And she doesn't know what to do. And John Mark says, well, why don't you tell your story? And I'm reminded that for thousands of years, we have been using stories in the middle of trying times as a source of distraction and as a source of comfort. And so that's why I'm so glad that we're doing this tonight. And so I'm going to tell you one of the stories that Salome tells to John Mark. And so this one takes place in 5 BCE, and it's about Yeshua's birth. When Yeshua was born, he wouldn't latch. I was living in the Mariotic community then, a handful of hovels cobbled together on a ridge outside of Alexandria, pressed between Lake Mariotis and the sea, Jewish seekers who'd shrugged off their inlays of alabaster and in-home mikvahs and unions of the flesh to allegorize all day inside prayer rooms in the dark. I saw the community members rarely, only at night, when they emerged like sea creatures, bleached and mouthing words they'd ridden in their minds over and over while the rest of the world went on without them. I was not supposed to be there. I was supposed to be serving in a clinic of my choosing in Alexandria. I was supposed to be prowling the library, sucking in the words of those physicians I'd heard Rufus, my teacher, mouth on about so many times. But on the voyage from Ostia to Alexandria, I realized I was with child. I had waited so long to have a life that was mine. I couldn't bear to share it with a baby. For days, I held out hope the world would do away with the child of its own accord. A storm's violent rocking would smash the blue-veined thing to bits, or my womb would surge and cramp and the being would expel itself of its own volition. I even tried the things Rufus claimed only the daft obstetrics did. I lifted heavy things. I pummeled at my belly. I asked an old widow from Syria for the hottest spice she had and then took a spoonful on my tongue. I could have filled a pessary with hellebore. That would have done the trick, but I'd likely have died with the baby, both our bodies sluiced into the sea and no one to tuck hibiscus in our shrouds, to balm our bodies with myrrh and musk. I didn't want to die uncertain that a single living soul would grieve my loss. Luckily, Simon, a Jewish merchant on the ship who chatted up anyone with ears enough to listen, took note of my mealy stomach and my terrified face and was shrewd enough to guess at my predicament. He had a cousin, he explained, who lived in a community a half-day's ride from the city. A desperate place, really, he said. I could fatten and give birth away from prying eyes and then pawn the baby off on an Egyptian family desperate for another brat to press papyrus. Then, when all was said and done, Simon declared, eyeing my medicine case, I could come and work for him. I consented. What choice did I have? I couldn't bring a squalling babe into the scroll room of the library, couldn't hold the cottering iron with one hand and wipe its tiny bottom with the other. So I spent 7 months alone, knifed by dusty winds, wiping the long Lebanon cedar tables down after the hermits had eaten their fill. Mostly bread and hyssop, fruit already fallen, an egg boiled and divided into servings so small they disappeared. The Jewish seekers found me an Egyptian midwife, and when the time came, she caught the child well enough. But the baby boy refused to eat. I had seen it 4 or 5 times before in Rome, and so when the midwife brought a tiny cup, I expelled and tipped the clay to his thin and howling lips, and he refused. I held his head to each breath at every angle I could think of, and he refused. I tickled the roof of his mouth with my pinky and let a little milk slide in beside, and he was satiated for an instant, but my nipple he refused. I let my breast dangle over him like swinging fruit. I took him to the sea and to the lake, let him rest on my still swollen belly as I washed away the blood that gummed my hairs together, and still he wouldn't latch. Xenia came to say the family wouldn't take the baby if he wouldn't nurse. A dead baby at planting time was bad luck. So I tried goat milk and cow milk, water and wine, cold cabbage leaves laid across my breasts. Sometimes he howled, and sometimes he stilled, all his limbs pulled up and in as though he wanted to be transported, slipped like a pessary back inside of me. I let the midwife make a tea from my placenta, and I drank it on the 3rd day because I knew that he was dying. His urine became thick and orange. His skin tented itself away from his bones. His indigo eyes were bottomless, and night folded in on itself, and he screamed the stars into being, and then he was quiet, and I couldn't get his eyes to open, though I tickled his feet and lifted him into the dust-stung air and hummed inside his ear. I won't draw this part out, except to say that Mari saved him. The arrival of Mari and Joseph at the Mariotic community is a different story. What is important to say is that my labor pains began when I saw them roll in on the cart, that I witnessed the way she wept and the way her own milk stained the front of her robe. I didn't know her name then, but I recognized her grief. So when my son was almost dead, I offered him to her, and she offered her breast to him, and he lifted his chin and sniffed, and a change came over his visage, a storm crossing the face of the waters, and he opened up his lips and found her. She bowed her head over him, and I felt, I know Joseph felt, a bond thickening between them, the two of us limp with love outside of it. That's all I've got.
That is more than enough. That is amazing. Thank you, Kaethe. I'm feeling like I felt the other night after Shannon Gibney read, and I have no excellent words. That was amazing. I wish you well on all of your revisions, because I would like to read the rest. Our next speaker this evening is Chaun Webster, and he won the Minnesota Book Award in Poetry in 2009. And I've read many thoughtful essays from him in the past few months. Welcome, Chaun.
Hello, hello. Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be a part of this event, and to be able to both hear from all of these authors, as well as to be able to share in this space tonight. So thank you to everyone that has made this possible, but then also to everyone that's come to share some time this evening with us. So I'm going to be reading from a folk tale that is interwoven through the book that I won the Minnesota Book Award for, Gentrification or the Scene of the Crime. So the title of this is called Communicator Whooping, or The Child Runs Faster Than Trouble. Just as one preface, like before I start reading, actually, the book is situated in North Minneapolis, and the book deals with geography and memory and Blackness, and that's about all that I'm going to say as preface. Each solitary stretch of the diaspora says, "Runaway child." So the child, they be a fast runner. Got a side of feet, got Tubman in they souls, run like Seminya they do. Fast enough to maroon, to move between here's. That child here. Beautiful production of Black spirit and flesh here. Wanna race trouble. Want to stride clear across the diaspora. Want to move atop the water like some say the Son of Man did long time ago. Except they not walking. This child fix it in their mind that they gonna race that trouble. Gonna meet up with it on some corner. We'll say the corner of Lowry and Penn, good kin and company, corner full of liquor and contained absence, corner bearing name of St. Cloud slave master, corner curating sex work and evacuated names. Gonna meet up there. That child sent out an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those niggas on they block about the whooping they about to secure for trouble's hide. Can you see it? A furious thing, the writing of this document, like most things urgent, written deliberately to be spoken over the breaks, to reverberate in the body, in the very natural rhythms of its intended audience, like the liner notes to some kind of riot. See child writing it. See child spinning them words on 2 dimensions, making the contours of a third. See child dancing on top of scrolls, abstracting into a dream journal. Cutting this way and that way with their feet. The kind of dance that conjures. Yeah, furious thing it was, and before you know it, child was rolling up that scroll nice and tight, tying hemp around it and throwing it over their back as they make their way to the corner. Child making their way to the corner to see if trouble come to resolve the terms of they whooping. But trouble don't show. Too busy doing what trouble always done, making trouble. Maybe this time in some Houston cell, or maybe at a doorstep in some sundown town, or maybe along Plymouth Avenue North after a party, or maybe in front of Cup Foods, or maybe trouble be in many places at once with their business. So child don't pay no mind to waiting. The child don't pay no mind to waiting, rather sends 2 blackbirds in the sky with the communicator whooping, the stately appeal to the niggas on they block, then sprinkles some Mississippi on they feet and moves they way along Fremont, Emerson, West Broadway, Vincent, Girard, speaking what sound like the good news, like the gospel according to Lord, Davis, Smith, and Wells Barnett. Now you may be asking, if trouble known to be making so much trouble, why don't they just show up to hear some silly terms, some outrageous challenge from a child? And it be due to the coward that trouble be. Trouble always strike from behind. Don't know no honest fight. And fear that child, all body and love, all Asada and Shango, all spirit and unmapped alphabet, charging through their veins. Trouble fear that child might show them up, might make trouble reckon with itself, reckon with how all that data and resource and theft of land and body and capital that not even no rocket charged Adidas could stop this whooping. It didn't take long with child moving across Fremont and Emerson, across West Broadway and Vincent, across Girard and Russell, sprinkling that Mississippi along the way, freaking that ground like Robert Johnson's hands did the guitar, sending out a sort of dispatch, some kind of new jive boogie, a magic in them words about the strength of child's feet, the length of they stride and the intensity of the whooping they about to rest up from the ground, the flies they about to leave swimming in trouble's milk. Nah, it didn't take long for trouble to catch wind. Hands wringing, blood boiling, so hot they was beside themselves. And sometimes hot blood make for untempered heads. Get one thinking that they better than they ought to think. And so trouble emerged from an unkempt place. You know, that place that know no good, that geography of bones, that precinct full of lying tongues and noxious smell and boundless animus. Yeah, you know that place. Trouble get up from there, from that place, and make their way to the corner good and slow. Child know trouble coming. Heard it by now from they kin, themselves the constellation of beautiful Black productions. Yeah, child know, and waiting for trouble. That night, trouble would race child. Child's kin all up and down Lowry Avenue watching, no cars, no observation of street lights, not even any shoes on child's feet, just a rugged determination to break the sound barrier. Child in trouble placed their feet on the line, standing between them 2 pillars on Lowry Avenue, faces steelly towards North 2nd, where the race would end. They agreed to begin at the siren. That siren that goes off at 9 p.m. like clockwork to some fire continuing to erupt. They're off. You ever wonder if feet hold memory? If there is somehow a cognizance in bones and muscle, joints and soft tissue, carrying child like Harriet's did before between Mason-Dixie and North Star? Seeing child along Lowry and James, Lowry and Gerard, Lowry and Fremont, you need not wonder. Child's body had its own vernacular, saying something, always saying. Trouble paddy wagoning behind as child remembers, cast their body into a story, into a biomyth, like the one they mama told them, of how Tubman managed to fashion her body into cast metal, how she stripped her skin down to a lead slug and slung herself from a trusted pistol. Time seems trivial when thinking of the aerials of that bullet, seen now somersaulting past more than Mason-Dixie, seen now maneuvering through the iron-ribbed steel of cages holding those who did not outrun trouble, seen now coaching the memory of feet tired and weary of running full term. Imagine child running toward fear at the pace of Madhubuti, because the home we chart is a sky of our own making, and the present has always been a dangerous place for children who dare to run faster than trouble. Do not turn away, Sandra. Do not turn away, Renisha. Do not turn away, Ayana. Do not turn away, Brianna. Do not turn away, George. Do not turn away, child. For when we draw our bodies closer to your feet, we remember also. Thank you.
Happy poetry noises, and yeah, thank you. I've heard you read from that book a few times, and every time the sense of movement and the visual and the sound all working together is so very pleasing and amazing. And thank you, Chaun. And our final speaker for the first half of our program is prose writer Diane Wilson. She's also, like, I think all of our readers tonight are also instructors at the Loft. And she is one of my favorites. This was a good panel. Nice job, me. I love all of you so much. So welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Wendy. It's really an honor to be here tonight and to be reading with Kaethe and Peter and Chaun. And I thank you for the invitation to be part of this event, and to everyone in Perham who've joined us. I wish we could all be together, but I also appreciate being able to be part of an event like this and not having to drive. So my name's Diane Wilson, and I am a descendant of the Bidewakan Tuan Oyate. I'm also enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. And for the past 20 years, I've been writing about gardening and working with indigenous seeds. And that's inspired my newest book, which is a novel called The Seed Keeper. And it'll be coming out in March of 2021. It'll be published by Milkweed. And so right now it's available for pre-order, but it's just in the final stages. So the book is it's a story told in 5 voices. And one of them is the seeds themselves, who remind us how seeds and human beings have always taken care of each other. The other voices are different generations in a Dakota family who protect these seeds. And so tonight I'm going to read the prologue from the book. It's about the main character, Rosalie Ironwing, who grew up near the Lower Sioux Reservation in south central Minnesota, and she was raised by her father in a cabin until he passed away from a heart attack when she was 12, and she went into foster care. And so she spends a good part of her life really trying to find family, find who she is, and find her community. So this prologue is a conversation between herself and the great aunt, Darlene Killsdeer, that she ultimately discovers. I opened the door that morning, and the world seemed to right itself, as if all those years had meant nothing but waiting for that one moment. When my great aunt Darlene Killsdeer used to tell this story, even to me, she was unsure if she had dreamed it. In a voice roughened from years of smoke and sweetened by cherry throat lozenges, she would tell me, "Rosalie, you walked in as if you had only stepped out for cigarettes at the corner store. As if all our lives we had lived next door to each other and gone to powwows together and traveled home in a second-hand ocean blue Pontiac with the driver's door wired shut with a bent coat hanger. As if I were there at the birth of your boy, close enough to cut the umbilical cord and to bury the placenta in the garden." The garden. What did you think when you walked into my small room? One side, a pharmacy of pills stacked near an old woman's recliner. The other side, by my window, a garden made of buckets and cans packed with precious soil I carried from the city's rose garden. I went at night, just after dusk, and filled my bucket nearly to the top, allowing a bit of room to spill, to lose a precious inch on the bus ride home, when the Washichus would glare as if no one wanted to sit too close to the crazy Indian with her heavy pail. No one offered to help when they watched me bump and drag that pail through the door. I did not need their help. In each container, I placed a single seed after wetting it first in my mouth. That wakes it, you see, tells the seed that the sleeping time is done. It's the spit that brings us together. People told me it couldn't be done. No, they said it shouldn't be done. Not on the third floor in an apartment building for elders. Think of the mess. Think of the inconvenience. Think of the strangeness of it. I could only shrug my shoulders, thinking of their strangeness in not seeing the absolute necessity for what I was doing. See that corn there? Have you ever seen anything grow so straight and tall? There's a good reason for what I'm doing. If I told you it came to me in a dream, would you believe me? How about if I told you that a crow, one with a husky voice that sounded like my sister Lorraine's after all her years of smoking, was the one who said it was time for me to plant this garden? You seemed surprised when you came in, but your call caught me by surprise too, caught in the moment of thinking about you, saying a prayer with the hope that wherever you were healthy and safe. After nearly 30 years, I didn't expect to ever see you again. That's why I started the garden. All those seeds in my closet, all that's left of my family, they had to be planted or they'd die, just like us. I showed the corn to you and your grown-up son, the boy with the rabbit eyes. You're not so much of a girl anymore, except to me. You were but 12 when your father had his heart attack and they took you. Never mind that you had family right here. I made phone calls and filled out their paperwork. At night, I walked the city hoping I might see you playing in a yard so I could sleep, knowing you were alive and well. Finally, I had to wait for you to find me. It was for you I started growing these plants with the hope that they could help me. They have their own way of talking, you know. It's not the same here as in a garden, where they share stories through their roots, through the soil, talking with their leaves and their tassels, sending love pollen on the wind. But it was something I could do. I could ask the plants for their help. I could ask the crow for her help. I could talk to the oak trees on the boulevard outside my apartment and ask them to watch for you. Year after year, we kept this vigil. And then this morning, you walked through my door when I had almost given up. You looked around as if you couldn't quite believe your eyes. I didn't have the energy to explain that it was the plants and the trees and the crow that brought you home. You sat on my best chair with your hands in your lap, your fingers twisting like an overgrown root. Behind you, I could see a brown shoe bouncing like its owner was about to bolt. Rabbit boy, you're safe here. You walked in, a stranger to me, your eyes hid from mine. You could not bear to know the truth, not yet. I couldn't breathe with you in the room. All of us starved for the same thing all these years. I offered to let you water the corn. You said no. I offered again, waving my hand at the plants. You held my watering can with fingers that trembled. A few drops of water, then you turned to me as if asking, was that enough? Did I do it right? I couldn't speak. I could only nod. Yes, yes, it was just right. It was all we could give to each other that first day. It was enough. You left with a promise to come back. My great aunt lived another year, and we found a way to talk to each other despite the few words that remained from the stroke she suffered barely 6 months after we were reunited. She wrote phrases on scraps of paper, struggled to shape her mouth around newly unfamiliar words, pointed at the photographs in dusty frames that sat on her television. Sometimes at night, we shared the same dream. Over time, as I helped her water her plants, we came to share the same memories. Learning my great aunt's unspoken language was no different from understanding the ways of plants, of animals, of the natural laws that bind us, regardless of whether we abide by them. You have to go back to the time before, Darlene said. See what happened to the families, especially the children. Go back to the place where the stories were left behind with our ancestors' bones. That's where you'll find our family. This is our story. Thank you.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate that as well. I'm really looking forward to reading more of that. Thanks. I am not particularly articulate tonight. I apologize, audience. I'm just really blown away by everyone's work. I've got feet that remember and stories that connect us, and there's this interesting ancestral thread running through everybody's work tonight. And I love it when the unexpected connections happen in these programs. It's definitely some of the magic of bringing writers together like that. So now I would like to ask a question of everyone. And if the audience has questions, now would be a great time to put them in the chat. So I would like to ask to start that, so much of writing comes from a place of curiosity and of having questions about people or events or life in general. And I'm wondering what's driving your writerly curiosity right now, even if you're in the midst of, I don't know, revising number 470. So, dear friends, what are you curious about?
Okay.
I will, go ahead. No, go ahead. I couldn't bear the silence. Go ahead, Diane.
Well, I was just, I really spend a lot of time writing and thinking about plants and seeds and their relationship to us as human beings, and then extending that a little further, our relationship then to food, which becomes in some ways a metaphor of our relationship to the land. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is that in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, and in South Minneapolis, when the grocery stores were closed down, then what I was looking at was the way in which, I mean, there was in the discussions around racism, that one of the things that I really look at and is the way that racism permeates our food system. And that you could see it, especially in that time after George Floyd, when with the grocery stores closed down, there was an entire area, including the Phillips neighbor, which is primarily a Native community, suddenly had no food system. And so that's something that I'm really interested in exploring in more depth.
I guess we're just gonna.
Go ahead, pop up. I mean, I don't have.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been such a strange time, as it has been for everyone. On top of, it's like disaster on top of disaster, and it's been hard to find a focus. Or I should say, at the beginning of COVID, it was hard to find a focus, and it was so easy to be distracted by just how much despair there seemed to be everywhere. It was so non-selective in how it was affecting people's lives. The pandemic was, and I remember so many mornings when I would have normally been reading the news instead, and just and having this sense of well, there's just no way out of this. We're just going to be miserable for the rest of our lives. And it sometimes still feels like that, certainly. But two things got me through it. And I don't know if it's that I'm so curious, is that I discovered something like a salve, I guess, or something to at least make the passage of this time a little bit easier. And it's no big surprise. But one of them was sort of redoubling my commitment to my students, which is strange because so many of them were struggling and having a hard time making sense of what they were doing, and like everyone else. But sort of together, we just sort of moved into this collective state of mind that was going to use at least part of our energy on our stories, and on the stories that they were writing, and the way that they were helping each other, and the way that they were talking to each other. And I think because of that, I was able to find a little focus myself. And it was incredible to me what a relief it was to be in their work and to be back in my work for those hours each day when I wasn't doom scrolling like it's so easy to do right now. And it was such a terrific reminder of the power of this thing that we do, which is to take people out of their own experience and put them in the experience of somebody else. And without my students and my own work and the books that I've been reading, and nights like tonight, it would be twice as gloomy and twice as miserable. And times like now, it doesn't actually even feel miserable or gloomy. It feels like there's a terrific hope in all of this. And I think and it's a wonderful reminder of this thing that we do, and its virtues, and its power.
Yeah, I don't know how many. I think one of the sadnesses in some ways about this time for me has been the lack of questions. I mean, other than, like, what are the COVID numbers now? Or, I mean, just that that I think it is hard to be curious when you're afraid. That's become kind of clear to me. And but that curiosity, I think, is also a means of hope, like if you can find the space and find the community to do that. I will say that for the novel that I've been working on, the two questions that were driving that for me, which seem less relevant now, but still important to me, were that I'm Christian, I'm ELCA Lutheran, very kind of social justice oriented, and all of the communal aspects of Christianity I've always been able to get behind pretty easily. But I've never been sure if I really believe that Jesus was resurrected. That's always been a little tough for me to wrap my head around. And so I basically kind of made myself write a book to try to figure out what I really thought about that. And it didn't really lead me to an answer. I'll just tell you that right now, but more questions, which is usually what books do. And then the other question that was driving the book for me was as a parent. I struggle with, I think lots of parents do, watching your kids become who they're going to be and knowing when to intervene and when to let them become who they are, even if that person or that part of them is deeply unfamiliar to you or scary to you in some way. And so to me, I try to like up the stakes of things in novels. And so I thought, well, what if like Jesus's mother had had a way to prevent his death? Would it have been the right thing to do for her to prevent that if she knew that what he wanted more than anything and what he believed was his calling in the world was to die? As a parent, would you be called upon to save your child? So those were the two questions driving that book.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that I have a lot of questions about any number of things. Like, and so like a lot of my work is I read a lot of texts that like pretty broadly, and I think that like I read a good essay from Don Lundy Martin a while ago, a poet, like fantastic poet that talked about like this like I'm forgetting the title exactly of the essay, but like it was an essay that was talking about like this sort of positioning against mastery, right? Like that I'm not necessarily interested in like mastering this discipline in some respect or another, like whatever we may think that might mean, but I think that a part of that like helps me to be grounded in a sense of like there are infinite number of like questions, and poetry is expansive enough, I believe, to hold them. And so yeah, that's it. Like, I mean, the work that I'm doing right now is mostly asking a lot of questions about the category of the human, and so is looking at a number of like Afro-pessimist texts, like Sakia Aman Jackson, as well as Calvin Warren's work, and asking questions about the nature of like the human as a category, right? Like, which is not something that has always been a part of history, right? Like that has its own kind of historical moment, and a number of things that are attached to it, and so the way in which Blackness kind of forms a border for the category of the human, as far as the perpetual outside of Blackness from the category of the human, and the way in which that kind of holds together this notion of the distinction between human and animal. And so a number of my work actually is looking at just the relationship between that sort of abject position of like Blackness and the way in which like placing things like in conversation, like the Middle Passage and industrial whaling, in particular, like, but not exclusively. And so, like, just thinking about the relationship that the institution of slavery itself had on the way in which non-human life was considered, specifically as a result of, like, and in connection to, I would say, the way in which you have, like, Blackness holding that kind of plastic border between the human and the animal. So I don't know what that work will be. Like, I'm just kind of in it right now, and I'm just like, I'm asking a lot of questions and reading a lot and writing a lot. But yeah.
Chaun, I remember in Rochester last year, you read like a stunning poem that I still think about. That's about the whaling in Middle Passage, right? That's a lengthier poem.
Yeah, that was like the kind of beginning of some of that work. Yeah. So yeah, I'm still in it.
So good. I mean, like, started talking about it and I was like, oh yeah, that poem I remember. Anyway.
No, thank you. Yeah.
It's exciting to kind of be in that space of just diving in and seeing where the resonating points are in odds and ends all over the place. I appreciate that aspect of creativity, and I think it's something that I've really enjoyed in having these conversations with writers in the last few months. This is my job. It's crazy sometimes. Like, I really appreciate, thinking about the way our brains just ping off of stuff and make those connections. Really exciting to hear about for me. I hope it's exciting for the audience to hear about as well, because it does. It helps me, like Peter was saying, get through all of everything that just sort of seems like it piles on sometimes right now, to be in this wonderful place of listening to people talk about what's gripping them. So thank you for all of that. We have a question about your reading habits this year from our friend Gail. Has your personal reading changed during this tumultuous year? And I think sometimes what I would add to that is, are you able to concentrate? I have a lot of friends that are just like, I don't have sounds like Chaun is reading as widely as ever, but yeah, has your personal reading changed during this year at all?
I mean, mine has, for a couple of reasons. One is the world has sort of demanded it of us, right? It's if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that I can't be a passive member of this society anymore. And so that means that I have to read about all sorts of things that make me uncomfortable, or that challenge my worldview, or that give me pause to look at the world through a lens that's not my own. And that's true of the books that I'm reading. It's true of the news that I'm reading. It's true of the genres that I'm reading. It's true of all of that stuff. And it's been, I mean, as challenging as it sometimes is, as difficult as it sometimes is to have those conversations with yourself, it's also feels like the most important reading that I've ever done. So all of that's true. It's also true that having a new book out in these times means that we're often, almost always, in my experience, doing events with other writers. So being exposed to all sorts of stories and writers that, though I may have been familiar with, now all of a sudden, in order to have an intelligent conversation with them, I have to know their work. And that has been a real, a lovely part of what these online events have done. And I just say again that all of this reading, I've never read so much as I've been reading this year ever. And, and that includes college and graduate school and everything. It's like, it's all there is to do. When I'm reading stories, fiction, that the relief of it it's added a whole new dimension to my experience of reading. Just almost anything. And including students' work and including the work of friends and colleagues, and including the books that I'm just reading because they're of the moment and they seem important to read. It's been one of the best and most profound reading years of my life, just unequivocally.
I'll just say something like briefly, but like, yeah, I mean, I want to qualify, because I mean, I do think it's important to say that, like, as far as like my reading practice is concerned, like, one, like, it takes a tremendous amount of effort, right? Like, because I have 4 kids, right? Like, and like I have 3 of whom are school aged and 1 is a toddler, right? So the youngest is just like 1, right? Like, and I mean, it's a wonderful life, right? Like, I love it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. And it's a tremendous amount of work, right? Like, it's a tremendous amount of work with a partner who's an educator, who's in the midst of a school district that has chosen to go into hybrid learning because we have a governor who decided to make a non-decision in terms of telling schools that they could make their own decision based on whatever data that they're saying that they're like, coming up with or not about whether or not they are past a threshold that's quite ambiguous and arbitrary in order to teach inside a classroom. So, like, I mean, we've had to do our own number of juggling, like I think a number of people have had to, as far as their livelihood. And I mean, I won't make too many complaints because we haven't had an interrupted paycheck like many people have. We have, the ability to provide for our family, which is a household of 6. And we are, we live life on the terms that we've, set out to live them, like, which is fairly consistent, like with, how we have been doing life prior to a global pandemic, prior to how we have been doing life before the unrest, like due to George Floyd. And I think a part of what I'm trying to say too is that I think that for some, like, a part of the interruptions that we see with COVID-19, but then also with the unrest in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, is that is something that is quite new. Those kinds of interruptions are quite new to some people. And I think that those are interruptions that are not new to everyone, right? Like, and I'll say specifically in this case that those interruptions are not new to Black folks, right? Like, and not just Black folks, but like, I'm speaking from my own subject position, right? Like, and so, like, to say, I think that, like, I understand, like, the question, right? Like, and I understand, like, the like the desire to, like, kind of see, like, in which ways, like, folks have shifted maybe some form of, like, direction. And this isn't necessarily even to take a kind of moral, like, high ground and everything, or to say that just as a result of the fact that somebody is of color or Black or Native, that they have, like, a perspective that, like, I might agree with, right? Like, but it is to say that these are not things that are new to Black folks, right? These aren't things that are, like, like, I don't think that the things that I'm reading right now as a result of, like, I mean, they're just things that I'm reading, right? Like, like, because I still got to do life, right? Like, in the midst of like any number of various, like, things. And it's just the work that I do. It's the work that I've chosen to do, right? Like, and so as a part of the work that I've chosen to do, like, I have certain things that are guiding, like, the questions, right? Like, and I think that a part of maybe what gets us in a better fighting position is to not be always always in a reactionary mode to like crisis, right? Like in that I think that, like, you know, when I think about, like, for instance, like just after like some of the like more immediate unrest, like after protests related to like the murder of George Floyd, you know, like I had done some drive arounds, like we live in North Minneapolis, like I had done some drive arounds to check in with some people and to see like how things were doing with, like, you know, some businesses and some things that I had heard about, like, you know, some fires that had gone on. But down Broadway, I mean, like there was a huge line related to, you know, folks getting, like, you know, groceries, right? But that need for food was like here before COVID, right? Like, you know, that need for food, like, you know, I mean, it's been slim, right? Like it's like, I mean, the number of choices that people have, especially like related to transportation to be able to get food, related to the number of like actual like storefronts that you have that have like, you know, groceries. Like, I mean, it's been slim, and not to mention just the fact that people just have like very little ability to pay, right? Like, you know, like who has the jobs that are paying the money that are, like, you know, able to actually, like, you know, it's just like there's a lot of people without work that have been without work for quite some time, you know. So I mean, even just in terms of that, I'm more rambling and I'm gonna stop, but like, I mean, it just yeah, like I know that I know folks that are just like, this has been like, you know, an exacerbated moment for a number of people, right? You know, that old adage, right? Like when what was it, like when Wall Street catches a cold, right? Like, you know, that Harlem like is got pneumonia, right? Like, you know, and so, and I mean, like, and it's not to make just those kinds of comparative analogies that, like, you know, are just to say that the pole is just a white and black pole, but it is to say that you know, there are, you know, a number of folks that have been dealing with these particular kinds of conditions that folks, you know, are identifying as somehow new for a while.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to dive in and thank you for putting that out there. Even though I've noticed changes in my neighborhood during this time, you know, folks living in parks and that I didn't see prior to COVID. It's, yeah, we're working with levels of stress that have been in the population. So yeah, thank you for drawing attention. Appreciate that. Diane or Kaethe, any words about reading right now?
Well, I've been buying a lot of books. So the stack by the bedside table, well, the stack everywhere, it just gets bigger and bigger, but I haven't had as the energy or focus to read as much as I normally do. So I try to keep up with, if friends have books coming out, for example, then I'll always try to keep up with those. But I think that's where I just kept my focus. I had to finish this book this year, and it was tough during when so much was going on. But, you know, you have those deadlines, and the blessing of them is that you have the deadline. So you drag yourself out of your bed and you get to work, because this is work that really matters to me. I think if you know, we've witnessed a number of crises, and we're still in a pandemic. But if you take the long view, I'm hoping that the work that we all do as writers is going to contribute to a longer longer view, you know, to make change over time to, we're going to come out of this and it'll be something else. So the reading, yes, has changed. I haven't done as much, and I do find myself doing more escapist reading, just a fiction that, you know, just I need to check out more than I have in the past, but I'm sure that'll cycle around too. When there's fewer deadlines, there's more mental energy. So I'm really looking forward to winter. I know that this first snowstorm was kind of a shock, but to me, we're entering into what is the dormant season, when everything around us is at rest. And if we pay attention to that, then we also get to enjoy that sort of storytelling, dreaming time that really is the essence of winter. So for me, this is the creative season, when I can just come inside and start to pay attention again to what is surfacing, what is coming up in you know, in my process. So yeah, not that much reading, but a lot of buying. So I look forward to reading all your books. How about you, Kaethe?
Yeah, I'm with you. Some escapist reading. I just finished a novel that I think probably, it looks like lots and lots of people have read, called A Man Called Ove, which was very funny and sweet, and kind of escapist. So I balance between like funny and escapist ones. Books that I'm reading with my kids. I just read Freddie the Detective. That was really good. And then also I'm teaching intermediate poetry, and the 4 books that we have focused on this semester are Natalie Diaz's When My Brother Was an Aztec, Kiki Petrosino's White Blood, Lucille Clifton's Blessing the Boats, and Tess Taylor's Rift Zone. And it's been really nice to have a balance, I would say, between like escapist reading that's funny on one hand, and then poetry that doesn't let you look away on the other hand. And it's been good to be able to have those books as a way of talking about this moment with my students. So yeah, all of it, but also forgiving myself for not being able to maybe focus as much as I would like.
I really do think Chaun said it best. You got to do life, and that is where we're at right now. And yeah, thank you all so very much for sharing your thoughts this evening. You all have such amazing perspectives, and I appreciate each and every one of you very, very much. I'm going to wrap us up here this evening. Thank you, audience, for your attention. Thank you, Viking Library System, and Gail and Susan. Do take some time to look up work by our writers and buy their books, even if they just sit by the bedside table for a bit. That is okay. And thank you again to Peter and Kaethe and Chaun and Diane. We will be hosting an additional 3 Moving Words events through November. So look up the schedule, and I hope to see you all very soon. Thank you. Good night.